Shaq O'Neal couldn't shake the uneasy feeling every time his 7-year-old daughter was near that daycare worker. Something was wrong. He just knew it. One evening, as the worker drove off with his daughter, Shaq's instincts kicked in, and he followed, his heart pounding. The car stopped near the woods, a place no child should be, and when Shaq saw what was happening, his worst fears became reality. What he did next would leave everyone speechless. Before continuing this amazing story, let us know where are you watching from? Also turn on notifications for daily upcoming stories like this. Let's begin the story. Shaquille O'Neal sat at the kitchen table, his massive hands delicately holding a tiny paintbrush as he watched his 7-year-old daughter, Amara, swirl vibrant blue paint onto her canvas. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of their modern home, casting a warm glow over the room. Amara was lost in her world of colors, her little fingers dabbing at the paper with intense focus. "Daddy, what do you think?" Amara asked, her big brown eyes full of excitement. Shaq leaned in, pretending to scrutinize the painting like an art critic. I see shades of genius here," he said, stroking his chin dramatically. "Is this a spaceship landing on the moon?" Amara giggled, shaking her head. "No, Daddy, it's a butterfly." Shaq chuckled, his deep voice filling the room. "A butterfly! That's what I was gonna say next." Despite the light-hearted moment, Shaq knew that deep down, Amara was still struggling with the absence of her mother. It had been 4 years since she passed, but the void she left was immeasurable. Shaq did everything he could to be both father and mother, but some days he saw the loneliness in Amara's eyes. His phone buzzed, reminding him of the time. It was almost time to drop Amara off at Sprout Daycare. He had spent weeks researching the best daycare in their wealthy neighborhood, ensuring it had top-tier facilities, an excellent reputation, and a curriculum that would nurture Amara's love for art and nature. Sprout Daycare checked all the boxes, or so he thought. The daycare sat in the heart of an elite neighborhood, surrounded by manicured lawns and tall iron gates. The building itself looked like something out of a magazine, pristine, welcoming, and elegant. Parents in designer clothes walked their children inside, exchanging polite greetings. Shaq, towering over them, couldn't ignore the curious glances sent his way. Even in casual clothes, Shaq stood out. His size, his fame, his very presence made people stop and stare. He was used to it, but here, in this predominantly white community, he couldn't shake the subtle feeling of being an outsider. He parked the car and walked Amara inside, holding her small hand securely in his. The moment they stepped through the doors, a woman with a carefully curated smile approached them. "You must be Mr. O'Neal," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Margaret, the director of Sprout Daycare. We're honored to have Amara with us." Shaq shook her hand firmly. Margaret was a middle-aged woman with sharp blue eyes and a voice that carried authority. There was something about her polished demeanor that felt overly rehearsed, but Shaq brushed the feeling aside. "Thanks for having us," Shaq replied. "Amara's been looking forward to this." Margaret knelt to Amara's level, her voice dripping with exaggerated warmth. "We're going to have so much fun, sweetheart. You're going to love it here." Amara gave a small smile but clung to Shaq's leg. "I don't want you to go yet, Daddy." Shaq knelt beside her, brushing a curl from her face. "You're gonna be fine, baby. I'll pick you up before you know it." As Shaq stood up, he noticed a young man watching them from across the room. He was tall, lean, with an easygoing smile that seemed a little too practiced. Margaret followed Shaq's gaze and gestured toward the man. "That's Greg," she said. "He's one of our best teachers. The kids adore him." Greg strolled over, his grin never faltering. "Big fan, man," he said, extending his hand. I grew up watching you play." Shaq shook his hand, but felt an odd sense of unease. Something about Greg's enthusiasm felt unnatural, forced. "Appreciate that," Shaq replied. "You take good care of these kids?" "Like they're my own," Greg said smoothly. "Amara's in great hands." Shaq nodded, though he wasn't convinced. He kissed Amara's forehead one last time and left, hoping this place truly was as good as it claimed. That evening when Shaq picked up Amara, he noticed she was unusually quiet. "How was your first day, baby girl?" he asked as they drove home. Amara hesitated, her small fingers twisting in her lap. "It was okay." Shaq frowned. "Just okay? You didn't make any new friends?" "I did," she said quickly. "But I don't like Greg." Shaq's hands tightened around the steering wheel. "Why not?" Amara shrugged, avoiding his eyes. "He's weird." "Weird? How?" She hesitated before finally whispering, "He just makes me feel funny." Shaq's stomach clenched. Kids had an instinct adults often ignored. He wasn't about to dismiss Amara's feelings. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" Shaq said gently. Amara nodded but didn't say more. Shaq made a mental note to keep a closer watch. As days passed, Shaq started noticing patterns. When he asked about Amara's progress, Margaret's answers were vague. When he voiced concern about Greg, she waved it off with a dismissive laugh. "Kids take time to adjust," she said smoothly. "Greg is wonderful with them." Shaq didn't like being brushed aside. His gut told him something wasn't right. One afternoon, while picking up Amara, he overheard two black parents whispering near the entrance. "I don't trust this place," one of them muttered. "I pulled my son out last month. Something's off." Shaq turned to them. "What do you mean?" The woman hesitated before lowering her voice. "Greg, my son started having nightmares. He refused to come back. When I questioned Margaret, she made me feel like I was crazy." Shaq's jaw clenched. Gaslighting, a classic tactic to silence concerns. He glanced at Amara, happily drawing in her notebook. His protective instincts kicked in. If something was happening at this daycare, he was going to find out. No one messed with Shaq O'Neal's daughter. Shaq's gut had never failed him before. On the basketball court, it told him where to move, when to shoot, when to pass. Off the court, it warned him when something wasn't right. And right now, it was screaming at him. Something was wrong at Sprout Daycare. Amara's unease wasn't just normal childhood jitters. There was something more. And as a father, it was his job to find out exactly what it was. It started one evening when Shaq was helping Amara change into her pajamas. As she lifted her arms, he noticed a small bruise on her forearm. "Hey, baby girl, what happened here?" he asked, gently touching the mark. Amara froze for a second before shrugging. "I don't know." Shaq frowned. "Did you fall?" She hesitated. "I think so." Shaq's gut twisted. Amara was an active kid, but she wasn't clumsy, and the way she avoided his gaze told him she wasn't telling the whole truth. "Baby, if something happened, you can tell me. I won't be mad." Amara nodded but stayed quiet. Shaq let it go for the moment, but his suspicions deepened. The parents who were silenced. Shaq decided to talk to the other parents, especially those who had voiced concerns before. He reached out to the black mother he had spoken to outside the daycare, introducing himself properly. Her name was Denise, and she had pulled her son, Elijah, out of Sprout Daycare just a few months ago. Something was wrong there, Denise admitted over coffee at a local cafe. Elijah loved daycare before, but when he started at Sprout, he became a different child, withdrawn, jumpy. He refused to talk about it, just like your daughter. Shaq leaned forward. "Did you ever figure out why?" Denise sighed. "Number. Every time I questioned Margaret about my concerns, she brushed me off. She made me feel like I was overreacting, and when I pushed harder, I got a letter saying Elijah had behavioral issues and wasn't a good fit for the daycare. Shaq clenched his fists. So she kicked you out for asking questions? Denise nodded. And I wasn't the only one. I talked to another mother, Maria. Her son came home with bruises too. Same vague excuses. She pulled him out, and now Margaret won't even return her calls. Shaq's blood boiled. This wasn't just a gut feeling anymore. This was a pattern. The next morning, Shaq walked into Sprout Daycare unannounced. He didn't care about making an appointment. He wanted answers. Margaret greeted him with that same overly polished smile. Shaquille, what a surprise. How can I help you? I need to talk about Amara. Margaret gestured to her office. Of course, please come in. Shaq followed her inside, his broad shoulders barely fitting through the doorway. He remained standing as Margaret sat behind her desk, folding her hands neatly. She came home with a bruise, Shaq said, getting straight to the point, and she won't tell me how she got it. Margaret gave a dismissive laugh. Oh, children play rough sometimes. It's completely normal. Shaq's eyes darkened. Amara isn't the only one. I've talked to other parents. Margaret's smile faltered for just a second before she recovered. Mr. O'Neal, I understand your concern, but I assure you, our staff is highly trained. You must understand, sometimes parents project their anxieties onto their children. I know my daughter, Shaq cut her off, and I know when something isn't right. Margaret sighed dramatically. Shaquille, you're an incredible father, but I worry that your protectiveness might be clouding your judgment. There it was, the subtle manipulation, making him feel like he was the one being unreasonable. But Shaq wasn't falling for it. I'll be watching, he said, his voice steady. And if I find out something's going on here, you'll be the first to know. Margaret's smile returned, but this time it didn't reach her eyes. Of course, we only want what's best for Amara. Shaq didn't believe her for a second. That evening, as Shaq helped Amara with her homework, she pulled a small, stuffed bear from her backpack. Where'd you get that? Shaq asked. Amara smiled. Greg gave it to me. Shaq's stomach twisted. Why? He said I was special. Shaq felt his heartbeat in his ears. Baby, I need you to tell me the truth. Has Greg ever done anything to make you feel uncomfortable? Amara hesitated, then shook her head. But Shaq saw the way she avoided his eyes. That night he barely slept. Something was very wrong, and he wasn't waiting any longer to figure it out. The next day, Shaq met Claire, a single mother whose son Ben also attended Sprout. Claire was skeptical at first, but when Shaq mentioned his concerns, her face changed. Ben said something strange last week, she admitted. He said Greg took him to the secret playroom during nap time. I thought he was imagining things, but now... Shaq's stomach dropped. We need to find out what's happening. Claire nodded. I'm with you, whatever it takes. And just like that, Shaq had an ally. Shaq and Claire knew they had to act fast. Every moment Amara and Ben spent in that daycare felt like a risk. They needed proof, something undeniable that would expose Greg and Margaret for what they were. The only way to do that was to catch them in the act. Shaq reached out to a tech-savvy friend, someone who knew how to set up discreet surveillance. They installed a tiny camera inside Amara's backpack, hidden within the fabric so no one would notice. Claire did the same for Ben, ensuring they had multiple angles of footage. We need to be smart about this, Shaq told Claire. One wrong move and they'll shut us out before we can expose them. Claire nodded. And we can't trust the authorities. Not yet. We need solid proof before we take this to the police. For days they waited, anxiously watching the footage each night. They saw small, unsettling things. Greg lingering too long near certain children, leading them into rooms away from the main play area. Margaret whispering to parents who looked uncomfortable but never spoke up. Then, one day, Amara's camera caught something terrifying. Greg led Amara and Ben toward the back door of the daycare. He glanced around nervously before ushering them outside. Shaq's heart pounded as he watched the footage. Where the hell is he taking them? The unauthorized field trip Shaq and Claire knew this was their moment. They quickly activated the GPS trackers they had placed in their children's shoes and followed the signal. Greg had taken them to a secluded, wooded area about a mile from the daycare. Shaq's hands gripped the steering wheel tight as he and Claire sped toward the location. If he lays one finger on them? Claire's face was pale, her hands shaking. We have to stop him before it's too late. They arrived at the park, parking far enough away to avoid being seen. They moved quickly but quietly, searching for their children. Then they heard it, a child's scared voice. Greg, I want to go back. Shaq's blood ran cold. That was Amara. They ran. Shaq burst through the trees, finding Greg standing too close to Amara and Ben. The children's faces were pale with fear. What the hell are you doing? Shaq roared. Greg's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. I was just taking them on a nature walk. Shaq didn't believe a word of it. He advanced, his towering frame casting a shadow over Greg. You took them out of the daycare without permission? Greg stammered, trying to step back. You thought nothing, Shaq growled. You don't take my daughter anywhere without my permission. Claire rushed to Ben, pulling him close. Come on, we're leaving. Greg's face twisted. You're overreacting, I was just... Shaq cut him off. Shut up. Greg paled. He tried to retreat, but Shaq wasn't done. You thought no one was watching, didn't you? You thought no one would notice. Greg swallowed hard, realizing he was caught. He turned to run, but Shaq grabbed his arm and yanked him back. You're not going anywhere, Shaq growled. Margaret arrived at the scene minutes later, followed by the police. She immediately started spinning lies. Shaq O'Neal attacked my employee. He's dangerous. But Shaq wasn't worried. He had the footage. Claire stepped forward. We have proof. Cameras, GPS, everything. The police reviewed the footage on the spot. Margaret's face drained of color as the truth unfolded. Greg was handcuffed, his protest falling on deaf ears. Margaret turned to run, but Shaq blocked her path. You let this happen. You protected him. The officers didn't let her go far before she too was arrested. The daycare was shut down within days. News spread fast, and the media picked up the story, highlighting not just Greg's crimes, but the systemic racism and negligence within Sprout Daycare. Parents who had been silenced finally spoke up. More children came forward with their experiences. The weight of it all came crashing down, and Margaret's long-protected network of wealthy, corrupt allies was exposed. Shaq stood before a crowd of reporters, holding Amara close. This isn't just about my daughter. This is about every child who was ignored, every parent who was dismissed. We need to do better. Claire stood beside him, a newfound strength in her eyes. And we won't stop until we do. The aftermath of Sprout Daycare's downfall sent ripples through the community. It wasn't just about Greg's arrest or Margaret's disgrace. It was about everything the daycare represented. The way people like Margaret used their power to silence parents. The way people like Greg thrived under that protection. The way racism seeped into every part of society, even places that were supposed to be safe for children. Shaq wasn't going to let it end here. Greg sat in a cold interrogation room, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of the evidence against him. The footage Shaq and Claire had gathered was damning. The bruises on children, the inappropriate outings, the unsettling conversations Greg had under the guise of mentorship. When confronted with the undeniable truth, Greg's bravado crumbled. He was no longer the charming daycare worker who hid behind fake smiles. He was exposed. Margaret's arrest came as a shock to many in the affluent community, but not to those who had suspected her corruption for years. The investigation revealed she had covered up multiple complaints about Greg and had close ties to influential figures who had shielded her from scrutiny. Some of these figures had their own secrets to protect, and Shaq quickly learned that taking Margaret down was only the beginning. Shaq sat in a dimly lit office, speaking with a lawyer who specialized in civil rights cases. "We can't just let this die down," he said. "We need to make sure nothing like this happens again." The lawyer nodded. "With your platform, we can bring real change. We can push for better regulations in childcare facilities, ensure proper background checks, and hold people accountable." Shaq's determination hardened. "Then, let's do it." As the case gained traction, reporters swarmed Shaq for statements. He didn't shy away. He used every interview to highlight the deeper issues: racism in the education system, the neglect of children's safety, the silencing of minority voices. One reporter asked, "Shaquille, do you think this incident would have been handled differently if you weren't a famous athlete?" Shaq took a deep breath. "Absolutely. If I was just another black father raising concerns, I would have been ignored, just like Denise, just like Maria. That's the real problem here. We shouldn't need fame to be heard." His words struck a chord. People began sharing their own experiences, their own frustrations with the system. Parents started demanding change. Protests were organized, petitions were signed, and within weeks, lawmakers were forced to respond. In the midst of all the chaos, Shaq never lost sight of the most important thing: his daughter. Amara had always been a bright, creative child, but after everything that happened, she became quieter. She still painted, but her colors were darker. Her once cheerful strokes turned into something heavier, more complex. One evening, as Shaq sat beside her in their home, he asked, "Baby girl, how are you feeling?" Amara shrugged, focusing on the painting in front of her. "I don't know." Shaq gave her time. He knew she needed space to process things on her own terms. "You know, when I was younger, I had things happen that I didn't understand. It made me angry, made me feel like the world wasn't fair." Amara glanced up at him. "What did you do?" Shaq smiled softly. "I found a way to let it out. Basketball helped me. It gave me a way to turn all that energy into something good." Amara thought about it for a moment before dipping her brush into a bright yellow paint. She added a splash of color to her dark canvas, blending it in with the shadows. "This helps me," she said quietly. Shaq nodded. "Then keep painting, baby. Paint until it all makes sense." As much as Shaq wanted to believe that justice had been fully served, he knew better. Margaret wasn't the only person involved in this mess. There were others, powerful figures who had benefited from her silence, who had been part of the network that allowed people like Greg to operate unchecked. One night, Shaq received an anonymous message. "You don't know who you're messing with. Walk away." Shaq showed Claire the message the next day. "They're trying to scare me." Claire frowned. "So what do we do?" Shaq exhaled. "We keep fighting." The story wasn't over. Not yet. The battle was far from over. Shaq knew that Margaret and Greg were just symptoms of a larger disease. The network of powerful individuals who had protected them still lurked in the shadows, and they weren't going down without a fight. The anonymous threats continued. Emails, phone calls, even a strange car parked outside his house for hours at a time. Whoever these people were, they wanted him to back off. But that only made him more determined. Shaq spent sleepless nights poring over documents, gathering information about the system that had allowed Sprout Daycare to operate unchecked for so long. With the help of investigative journalists and civil rights attorneys, he discovered a disturbing pattern. A chain of daycares, all owned or influenced by the same elite group, had been involved in similar scandals, yet managed to sweep their crimes under the rug. Money, power, and silence had protected them for years. Claire stood by him every step of the way. "They think they can scare you into silence," she said one evening, looking through files at his kitchen table. "But they don't know who they're messing with." Shaq sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's not just about me. It's about Amara, about every kid who's been through this. We have to shut them down." Claire nodded. "Then let's expose them." With the help of investigative reporters, Shaq and Claire began piecing together a damning case. They connected with other parents whose children had suffered under the system. Some had been afraid to speak out, fearing retaliation, but when they saw Shaq take a stand, they found the courage to step forward. One mother, Denise, told her heartbreaking story in an interview. "My son came home crying every day. He told me Greg would take him to the special room, where no one else was allowed. When I tried to complain, Margaret told me I was overreacting, that I was just an angry black mother. I was silenced, but not anymore." Shaq's name gave the movement power, but it was the collective voices of the parents that gave it truth. Soon, social media erupted with the hashtag #ProtectOurKids, and people across the country demanded justice. But the people in power weren't going down without a fight. A smear campaign against Shaq began almost immediately. Tabloids ran stories about his past, twisting his words, making him out to be an angry celebrity looking for attention. Some politicians called him a race baiter, claiming he was exaggerating the issue for personal gain. Then, things escalated. One evening, Shaq was driving home when he noticed the same black SUV tailing him. He pulled into a gas station, hoping the car would keep going, but it stopped across the lot. A man in a suit stepped out, his expression unreadable. Shaq tensed as the man approached. "Mr. O'Neal," the man said calmly, slipping a business card into Shaq's hand. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into. Walk away before you regret it." Shaq glanced at the card. It had no name, just a phone number. He crushed it in his fist. "I don't scare easy," the man smirked. "We'll see about that." A week later, Shaq's house was vandalized. Spray-painted messages covered his front gate. "Liar, troublemaker, walk away." Claire arrived minutes after Shaq discovered the damage. "They're getting desperate," she said, anger in her voice. "They know we're close." Shaq clenched his fists. "Then we hit them harder." The night the full investigation aired on national television, the world finally saw the truth. Journalists had uncovered financial records proving that Margaret's daycare was just one of many under the same corrupt network. High-profile donors, politicians, and even law enforcement officers had worked together to cover up abuse, silence parents, and keep their institutions running. The fallout was immediate. Protests erupted in front of city halls. Parents demanded resignations. Some of the most powerful figures involved were arrested. The corruption ran deep, but now it was all out in the open. Despite the victory, Shaq knew the fight wasn't over. Laws had to change. Oversight had to improve. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. As he tucked Amara into bed that night, she looked up at him with big, curious eyes. "Daddy, are the bad guys gone?" Shaq kissed her forehead. "Some of them. But I'll always be here to protect you. And now a lot more people will too." Amara smiled sleepily. "You're my hero." Shaq felt his heart swell. He wasn't a superhero. He was just a father. But that was enough. As he walked out of her room, he checked his phone. Another message had come through, this time from a congresswoman who wanted to work with him on childcare reform. The fight wasn't over. But this was just the beginning. The fight had begun with Sprout Daycare, but it wasn't going to end there. Shaq knew that taking down one corrupt institution wouldn't fix the deeper problems. He had seen firsthand how easily people in power could silence the voices of the vulnerable. Now, he was determined to make sure those voices were heard. The momentum from the exposé continued to grow. Parents, activists, and legal experts across the country rallied behind Shaq's mission. What had started as a single case of abuse had now turned into a full-scale movement calling for legislative change. Shaq used his platform to push for stronger regulations in childcare centers. He met with lawmakers, attended hearings, and gave speeches about the systemic failures that had allowed places like Sprout to operate unchecked. Claire, now an official advocate for child safety, stood beside him every step of the way. One afternoon, Shaq and Claire sat in a government office, waiting for a meeting with a senator who had taken an interest in their cause. Claire leaned over and whispered, "You ever think you'd end up here?" Shaq chuckled. "Not in a million years, but if it helps protect kids like Amara, I'll keep showing up." But even as progress was being made, the threats hadn't stopped. The same network that had protected Margaret and Greg still had powerful allies. There were those who saw Shaq as a threat to their way of doing business. One evening, while driving home from a meeting, Shaq noticed a familiar black SUV in his rearview mirror. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. He pulled into a public parking lot and watched as the car slowed but didn't stop. It was a warning. When he got home, he found a package on his doorstep. Inside was a single note. "Some battles aren't worth fighting." Shaq showed the note to Claire the next day. "They think they can scare me." Claire frowned. "Are they wrong?" Shaq exhaled. "They should be the ones scared, because I'm not stopping." After months of lobbying, pushing, and refusing to back down, Shaq of Forts paid off. A new law was passed requiring stricter background checks for daycare employees, increased oversight of private childcare institutions, and protections for whistleblowers. But victories came with sacrifices. Shaq had lost friends, received constant threats, and spent countless sleepless nights. There were moments when he wondered if it was worth it. But then he would look at Amara, see her sleeping peacefully, and remember why he started this fight in the first place. One evening, Amara sat at the kitchen table, painting as Shaq watched. She was using bright colors again, vivid blues, warm yellows. "What are you painting, baby girl?" Shaq asked. Amara smiled. "A superhero," Shaq chuckled. "Yeah? What's their superpower?" She looked up at him with a grin. "They never give up?" Shaq felt a lump in his throat. He reached out and ruffled her hair. "That's a good superpower." As the sun set outside, casting a golden glow over their home, Shaq realized that while the fight would never truly be over, he had already won the most important battle of all, keeping his daughter safe. And that was a legacy worth fighting for. Shaq had won a major battle, but the war was far from over. The law had changed, but the corruption that allowed Sprout Daycare to operate was still embedded in the system. The same people who had tried to silence him were still out there, regrouping, looking for ways to strike back. And Shaq knew that his fight had only just begun. With every step forward, the threats against Shaq and those who stood with him escalated. Anonymous emails, threatening letters, and even strangers approaching him in public, warning him to stop. Some of the people he had exposed were losing money and power, and they wanted revenge. One night, Shaq received a phone call from an unknown number. When he answered, a deep voice spoke on the other end. "You think you won? This is bigger than you. Walk away, or you'll regret it." Shaq stayed silent for a moment, his grip tightening on the phone. "I don't scare easy." The voice chuckled. "Then you're a fool." The line went dead. He exhaled slowly, then turned to Claire, who had been watching him from across the kitchen table. "They're not giving up," she nodded. "Neither are we." Determined to find out who was behind the threats, Shaq started digging deeper into the web of corruption that protected predators like Marguerite and Greg. With Claire's help, they uncovered a network of influential figures who had been profiting from unregulated daycare centers for years. Some of them were politicians, others were wealthy business owners, and they all had one thing in common. They had everything to lose if Shaq kept exposing them. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous things became. One evening, as Shaq was leaving a meeting with a group of activists, a car sped toward him in the parking lot. He barely had time to jump out of the way before it swerved and disappeared into the night. It wasn't an accident. It was a message. When the police arrived, they took a report, but Shaq could tell they weren't eager to investigate. Some of the officers exchanged glances, hesitant, as if they knew who was behind it, but were too afraid to act. Claire clenched her fists. "They're trying to scare you into silence." Shaq looked at the tire marks on the pavement. "It's not working." Realizing that the law alone wasn't enough, Shaq and Claire decided to take matters into their own hands. They formed an independent organization dedicated to exposing corruption in childcare and advocating for survivors. With the help of journalists, lawyers, and activists, they started gathering evidence, interviewing whistleblowers, and putting pressure on lawmakers to take action. At first, their progress was slow. The people they were up against had deep pockets and powerful connections. But then, a breakthrough. An anonymous informant came forward, offering documents that linked high-ranking officials to the cover-ups at Sprout and other daycares across the country. The evidence was undeniable. It was time to take it public. Shaq arranged a press conference, knowing that once this information was out, there would be no turning back. The world needed to see just how deep the corruption ran. The day of the press conference, reporters packed the room. Cameras flashed, microphones lined the table. Shaq took a deep breath and stepped forward. For too long, powerful people have used their influence to protect predators and silence victims. That ends today. He presented the evidence, detailing the extent of the corruption and naming names. The room erupted with gasps, whispers, and frantic note-taking. Within hours, the news spread like wildfire. The officials named in the document scrambled to deny involvement, but the proof was overwhelming. Protests erupted in multiple cities, demanding justice. Investigations were launched, resignations followed, and some of the most powerful figures in the network were arrested. But Shaq knew this was just the beginning. The people behind the threats hadn't all been exposed yet. Some were still hiding in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike back. Late one night, Shaq's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You made a mistake. We're coming for you." He stared at the screen, then looked over at Amara, who was asleep on the couch with a book in her hand. He had won a battle, but the war wasn't over. Shaq exhaled, his resolve hardening. He had faced threats before. He had taken on giants and won. And no matter what came next, he would never stop fighting to protect the innocent. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. If you want part 2 of this story, let us know in the comment section. We will upload it tomorrow. So, turn on notifications for the update of next part. Thank you for watching.